So, with that, I'd like to hand it over to Harrison Nesbit from Groundwork Hudson Valley to present on nature based features and the Saw Mill River Watershed.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you all for joining. Good morning. It's early. I can't believe how hopefully articulate I'll be. So I'm very excited about that new side of myself. Alrighty, let's jump in. So I'm going to be speaking today about case studies for nature-based solutions within the Saw Mill River Watershed. This is based on a report that Groundwork Hudson Valley did in from about July through October of last year, and I'm really excited to speak with you all about it. I'm Harrison Nesbit, Climate Resilience Manager at Groundwork Hudson Valley. It's a brief overview of what I'll be covering today, give a brief background on our history as stewards of the Saw Mill River, some background on the report, and then we'll dive into some of the case studies that we developed. And at the end of the webinar, I'll also share the report if anyone's curious to look at that. So Groundwork Hudson Valley is an environmental nonprofit based in Yonkers, New York, and our organization has three program areas: sustainability education, which offers STEM curriculum to Yonkers public schools and operates the Science Barge, a floating living laboratory completely off the grid right in the Hudson River, and it's open to the public summer through fall. So I encourage everyone, especially those with kids, to come and check it out. But also, if you're just curious to see an aquaponic farm, come by. We also have the youth programs, or our Green Team. It's a group of 30 high school students from Yonkers Public Schools that learn leadership skills through paid hands-on environmental work, planting trees, removing invasive species, and tabling at community events. And then finally, there's the Climate Resilience Program, which I lead, which promotes nature-based solutions through for adapting to warmer, wetter weather. Um, And we do this through geospatial analysis, reports, and demonstration projects. We also lead an air quality monitoring program, a community science tree inventory, and we host a number of working groups for residents of Yonkers. And finally, we also coordinate the Saw Mill River Coalition. What is the Saw Mill River Coalition? It is a partnership between nonprofits, municipalities, and businesses. It was formed way back in 2001 with a vision of revitalizing the Saw Mill River and helping people to enjoy it. One of the first major projects that the coalition led was the daylighting of the Saw Mill River, pictured here in downtown Yonkers. Really exciting project that um, has really been like an enormous success. As you can see below, things are thriving. The coalition helped to organize public engagement events around this project, brought together different stakeholders to promote it. And over the last couple decades, we've worked with the coalition, which includes public officials from Westchester County and from 12 watershed municipalities to promote adequate planning and restoration projects along the river. As a coalition, we've also released a number of reports, the last of which I'll be focusing on today. We also do a lot of stewardship along the Saw Mill River. Our green team assists with members of the coalition and other conservation advisory councils with their Trees for Tribs programs. We also loan tools to organizations and help out when we can if they're interested in doing a cleanup at a local site. I'm always happy to give some um, tips on how to organize folks and what you might need for the day of. So give a shout if you're interested. I'll share my email at the end of this. We continue to do a lot of work just restoring the riparian forest, removing invasives, and planting more native trees. We also organize the Great Sawmill River Cleanup. I think we're going into like our 15th year or so, which is pretty great. It's our oldest community event, and alongside our great volunteers who come year after year, we've removed hundreds of tons of trash from the river, removed loads of invasive plants. So join us if you're free this year. It's on April 26th, and I'll also have a reminder for that at the end of this. And we're starting to see some real improvements. I think folks are starting to get a little upset that they're not pulling as much trash out as they used to. So we have to think about, do we want to do a bio blitz? What else do we want to do with this? But that's a good position to be in, I think. All right, I'm moving slowly into the focus for today. But this project that we had started back in 2022 with a report that we did with the New School's Urban Systems Lab to do flood mapping for the entirety of the Saw Mill River watershed. They used a CityCat model um, to get baseline data for 1 hour storms for 10 and 100-year storms, or 1% and 10% storms. I know that those numbers are becoming more and more arbitrary, but I think it's still a good way to organize it. The main findings from that report is that it highlighted communities along the Saw Mill River that are especially vulnerable to flooding by layering it over with a lot of socioeconomic data. It also identified a number of creeks and depressions leading into the Saw Mill River that are not consistent with FEMA flood models. So essentially, we found more areas that are vulnerable to flooding than are shown on the FEMA or illustrated through the FEMA flood models. I also wanted to include this photo on the right, just to kind of demonstrate how our background and ethos of engaging with the community has continued as we've launched into more report writing. I think this is a really great um, articulation of that, in that GIS maps can only communicate so much and can only be so accessible. So by including photos from our from community members up and down the river, you kind of get a sense of what dark blue means. What does that look like on a rainy day? And it's a great way to visualize that with an additional layer. So I think that we're always thinking about ways to do data storytelling, and I think this is a powerful way to do that. And also just to get folks engaged with what we're working on. People want to talk about flooding, clearly. Following the release of that report, we organized a number of flood site tours. So I'll start by saying that a lot of this work was funded through the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Hudson River Estuary program. So thank you for that. And after we finished our flood modeling with the New School's Urban Systems Lab and released a subsequent report that you can find on our website, we presented our findings to the Saw Mill River Advisory Board and then collaborated with New York Assemblywoman Mary Jane Shimsky and Westchester legislator David Imamura, as well as members of the Saw Mill Advisory Board, or SWAB, to host a couple flood site tours that were featured in the Urban Systems Lab report in that effort to bring together stakeholders and determine what to do with this data, what would be our next steps. Both the tours were really successful, cold, rainy days in February, but people really toughed it out, which was great to see. And a lot of the input that we received um, was around developing conceptual designs for nature-based solutions within the watershed that would be focused both on the main stem and tributaries, because we thought that these designs would be helpful in getting more funding for capital infrastructure projects, but we also wanted to complement the findings of the forthcoming Resilient New York report for the Saw Mill River, which is really going to have a focus on the main stem. And for those who don't know, I thought I would just have a quick couple slides on what do we mean when we say nature-based solutions. I think our viewpoint is that we should be taking a holistic approach when thinking about climate adaptation and resilience. I'll say that nature-based solutions should not be chosen instead of hard gray infrastructure, like expanding culverts or raising bridges and the like, but they should be done in tandem or as a complement to those. Not all sites are apt for nature-based solutions, but where there are opportunities to do it, they should certainly be considered. Beyond including nature-based solutions and gray infrastructure in your climate adaptation toolkit, it's also important to remember that monitoring for woody debris and other detritus is another key to mitigating flooding. So I think it's helpful to think about it as a mosaic. There's no panacea, right? So nature-based solutions should mimic natural ecosystem functions. The interventions that we recommend in this report are focused on retaining stormwater and reducing inundation during heavy rainfall events that lead to riverine flooding, though they also enhance climate resilience more generally. And as many of you know, the reason why the Saw Mill River draws so much attention is that it's usually a pretty tame river. Few people even might not even notice it, but when it rains, it really impacts hundreds of thousands of commuters who rely on the Saw Mill River Parkway, which runs adjacent to the river and is right in the floodplain. The Saw Mill River is also the southernmost tributary to the Hudson River. It's a really developed area going through southern Westchester, so it's also quite compromised by invasive species, and the riparian forest is in disrepair throughout most of the southern half of the river. We also get a lot of woody debris, which blocks culverts and contributes to flooding. And I think the last thing about nature-based solutions that is important to note is just the various co-benefits it brings, from supporting biodiversity to improving water quality and providing more green space for residents. And it can also strengthen grant proposals. Thought I would just include a couple more snapshots of, I'm going to bring up some terms in when I'm going through some of our renderings, and I thought it might be nice to just to have an illustration of what I'm talking about early on. So in the last slide, I'm going to go back and be crazy. I'm going to go back for 1 second. This is an image of regenerative stormwater conveyance, which is really great to do if you are working nearby outfalls. I'll bring this up in one of the first case studies. Here's an image of a floodplain bench. So if you think about an urban stream, it has a very steep banks and an incised channel, so the water doesn't really have anywhere to go and just rushes downstream. So this creates a lower area adjacent to the channel so that there's a wider flow path. You can kind of carve out the upper bank to make it a separate channel almost. Here's another photo of what that might look like. These are also attached in our report if anyone's curious to look at these again. Another neat one that I wanted to highlight briefly are sand seepage wetlands. These allow for water to pool and slowly filter, and they help to stabilize streams and can also improve water quality, which is something that we know that a lot of the municipalities that we were working with were keen to see. And lastly, riffles. These are just a sign of a healthy stream pattern. They help to oxygenate water, which supports wildlife. They can also help to improve water quality by taking out sediments and to stabilize banks. All right. So the flood site tours that I was speaking about a few slides ago were super, super helpful in determining what our potential list of sites would be that we would focus on. The full list of sites is listed in our report, and I'm sure that there are plenty more to cover. So please, if there are any that you're interested in, get in touch, let us know. We visited our priority sites a few times and had discussions with municipal representatives, members of conservation advisory councils, to define what specific sites and priorities they were interested in. We then developed a short list of criteria that we'd want to see. So we were looking for areas where residential or business communities were burdened by flooding, sites that were suitable for nature-based solutions. We worked with Biohabitats, an ecological restoration firm, to provide some insights here. They were invaluable. We also wanted to focus on brooks and tributaries that were highlighted in the USL maps, again, because we didn't want to be duplicative with the Resilient New York report, which would be focused on more of the main stem. And we worked with members of that report throughout this process to ensure that some of the things that we bring in would be complementary to that report. Another element that we wanted to highlight was to consider previous reports that had been made for these sites, whether that be from the Westchester County or the Army Corps of Engineers. We thought it would be helpful to bring together a lot of different strands and develop a report that collated and synthesized findings in an effort to gather some momentum here. And again, one of the aims of this report is to apply for grant funding and to develop more precise analysis, which I'll speak to in some later slides. So in this next bit, I'm going to start with an overview like this, and then I'll zoom in to provide some of our conceptual landscape designs. So the first case study that I'm going to bring up here is Boutilliers Brook. It's a tributary in the Saw Mill River in Hastings-on-Hudson. The parcel owner is the village of Hastings-on-Hudson. This is a 1.5 acre site, which is half of which is in the 100-year floodplain. The drainage area is just under 1/4 square miles. according to the United States Geological Survey stream stats. And the flooding that you get here is mostly residential. The two outfalls that represent the spurs are pictured here. One of them is pictured here, and these are really dominated by invasive plants, namely kudzu. Both sides of the channel slope steeply and are heavily eroded. And there's also a fair amount of litter and dumped material at this site. I want to note too that we used trail cams here to develop time-lapse footage of flooding. This is something that we really want to emulate at other sites where possible. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about how can you provide some like visual storytelling? How can you complement data with those visuals? And we found that doing that time-lapse photography is really captivating. I think the issue is just getting the angle just right, and making sure deer don't just stand in the way and munch for a while. We also, I want to show you some screenshots of the Urban Systems Lab's hydrodynamic flood maps, which were really instrumental in identifying flood vulnerable areas and locations that aren't represented in the FEMA maps. So going clockwise, we have our base map, then a FEMA map, and then our 10-year and our 100-year storms for 1 hour simulation. So the two screenshots on the bottom half of your screen are from the Urban Systems Lab report. And I should add that the flooding area doesn't expand too much from the 10 to 100 year, but the depth does increase. There are also links to these maps in our report if you want to click around a bit more. I think clicking is really the key term when you're talking about GIS. It's just clicking. It's really hard, but it's clicking. All right. So for each section, I'll show an existing conditions, pictured here, followed by our proposed conditions. So in addition to flood mitigation, other priorities that were identified by the municipality and the Conservation Advisory Council for Hastings-on-Hudson were to address erosion and the need to stabilize the stream bank, to improve water quality and improve wildlife habitat. They also wanted to make sure that flooding throughout that what we noticed from one of the reports was that there's flooding throughout the Boutilliers Brook watershed, and that's likely because many of the culverts are undersized. Some mitigation strategies are a challenge here because the brook transects a lot of residential properties, and some strategies may contribute to more issues downstream, which is not something we want to contribute to, right? Maybe you can fix flooding on your site, but that could just allow water to pass by more quickly and inundate a site downstream. Additional analysis at this site and others are still needed to determine the primary causes of flooding. So some of this information should include more precise data on outfall locations and conditions, soil compositions, detailed topography and channel characteristics, as well as hydrologic and hydraulic or H&H conditions. Here is our proposed conditions rendering or conceptual design. Biohabitats, their input here was really invaluable. They provided us with precedent projects that we used, and I'll review later in this presentation, and they also highlighted some more site-specific interventions. But I just want to reiterate that these interventions also respond to the goals and interests that community members brought up. And that once again, that prior to any demonstration projects being constructed, we still need to do that additional analysis to really determine what the primary causes of flooding are at each site. So a quick review of some of the strategies that are included here. We want to increase flood storage capacity by developing floodplain benches that will both control erosion to help with the woody debris and expand the floodplain. We'll also support floodplain connectivity through wood structures like log sill and jams, which slow stormwater and provide aquatic habitat. And at the outfalls, we recommend a technique that we previewed in that earlier slide called regenerative stormwater conveyance, or RSC. It's also sometimes just referred to as step pools. Um, it's a system that uses riffle weirs, pools, and other media beds to attenuate flows and support the stability of stream channels and improve water quality. But again, we still need to do some research on the condition of the outfall structures and really get a sense of velocity and controls there. Our next site that we'll focus on is also in Hastings-on-Hudson, but this one is more on the main stem, but it's one that routinely floods and that a lot of folks in Hastings had brought up to us as a site of interest. The parcel owner for this site is New York State Department of Transportation. It's a half acre entirely within the Hudson River floodplain, as you can see. The approximate drainage is 22.4 square miles, according to USGS stream stats. And the flooding here impacts both residential homes and a major transportation corridor in the Saw Mill River Parkway, as well as roads leading into and out of Hastings-on-Hudson. So this is why it's a really visible site, which is probably why it was brought up to us a number of times. During heavy rainstorms, the area becomes completely inundated and leads to dangerous driving conditions along the Sawmill River Parkway and the road leading into Hastings-on-Hudson. Residents have even been seen canoeing in the area following storms. Some photos of this can be found in our report. But I also want to highlight a photo on the bottom right here, which shows some kids swimming at a swimming hole in this area in 1927, just a few years before the parkway was developed in this part of Hastings. It's difficult to imagine the Sawmill River being used recreationally, but it's happened in the past, so maybe it can happen in the future again if people are bold enough. They want to swim with the eels, I guess. I think it's fun. Here's some of our GIS maps. The main takeaways here again that the area is really vulnerable to flooding during heavy rain events and riverine flooding. It really becomes quite inundated. Here's our existing conditions rendering. The bridge seen in this image is just north of the site and likely exacerbates flooding in this area because it's undersized and can be and is often clogged by woody debris. What I mean by that is there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many invasive plants and trees along the Sawmill River, as well as just older trees and what you experience through what we've seen through emerald ash borer and other. Um, but essentially, what happens is these trees and these plants fall into the river, and they clog the culverts. So woody debris is what I mean there. So that's another interest in planting more native plants and thinking about erosion is helping to deter the amount of woody debris that we would find in the river and other areas of catchment there. Some of the priorities that folks brought up here were flood retention and resilience, mainly concentrating on the Sawmill River, not Boutilliers Brook, and riparian forest restoration and native plantings, and public safety to improve driving conditions during flood events. So considering that most of the flooding here is from upstream, the aim is to create a resilient landscape in the flooded area. Some strategies that we highlight here include developing a floodplain bench to both expand and connect the floodplain and divert water away from the Sawmill River Parkway. We're also recommending a berm in this area to improve road safety along Farragut Parkway and the Sawmill River Parkway. Stream bank stabilization and the berm will be supported through native vegetation. We put TBD, gray infrastructure, over that bridge because this is probably a site that might be seen as a high-risk area in that New York resilience study, but we'll see. But that's another one of those examples of gray infrastructure and nature-based solutions working together. That mosaic. This is another case study. I think this is a really interesting one in the town of Greenburgh. So the parcel owner for this site is both the town of Greenburgh and Con Edison, which has an easement on the transmission lines that run through the center of the site. This is our largest, it's 12 acres, and it sits at the confluence of the Rum Brook and the Sawmill River. So this is going back to a site that we're really focused on the tributary. It is also entirely within the 100-year floodplain. The drainage area is approximately 17.8 square miles, and this site has been flagged in a number of reports, including the Army Corps of Engineers reconnaissance plan for the Sawmill River in 2012, among others. Flooding here impacts the Sawmill River Parkway, but also the South County Trail, and likely contributes to flooding at residences and businesses upstream from here. I also want to bring up Babbitt Court, which is a neighborhood that you can see on the right side of your screen that is routinely flooded, even if there's just like a half inch of rain. So hopefully some of our interventions here would address that. A lot of the flooding here is caused from dead ash trees, likely from the emerald ash borer. The area is also choked by really fast-growing invasive plants. There's a lot of moringa that you can see at the bottom. I first visited the site in the winter. I was remiss not to take any photos, and then by the time I got there in the summer, I couldn't pass through. So we actually hired a drone pilot to get these shots. There's a link in our report to some of additional videos that are pretty thrilling. It's kind of cool to see a drone kind of dip into this area that really you can't um, traverse easily. Flooding here likely impacts areas upstream, including Elmsford and, as I mentioned, Babbitt Court. The latter is a really small residential community that is, as I mentioned, routinely burdened by flooding. Some priorities, this is our existing conditions. And priorities included flood mitigation, concentrating on the Saw Mill River, but also riparian forest restoration. We also thought about expanding opportunities for passive recreation, given that it sits between the South County Trail and a Little League field. So this is when nature-based solutions, not only can you mitigate flooding, but how can we open up the space to both support biodiversity, but also allow for more passive recreation for folks. So given the size of the area, there are a number of strategies that we've included here. One key one that would be helpful is hummock and hollow grading or microtopography. This would develop more high and low points to control flows, and it would also help to slow down stormwater and support biodiversity. This is a way of sort of mimicking the natural flow of a river and the microtopography that you might see in a natural, healthy stream. Additional recommendations would be to include grading and wetland restoration, which would support floodplain connection. Native plants here would, of course, be included. And given that there are many dead ash trees, there might be an opportunity to use the ash trees to develop natural grade controls, such as log jams, to help with erosion and further support aquatic habitat. And similar to Boutilliers Brook and the Northern Spurs site, we've included regenerative stormwater conveyance around the outfalls. And onto Mount Pleasant and Thornwood. This is our final case study that I'll speak about today. The parcel owner for this is the town of Mount Pleasant and the Mount Pleasant Water District. It sits, oh, pardon me, no, the parcel owner is just the town of Mount Pleasant Water District. And it sits between the base of the Nannyhagen Brook, which is also a tributary to the Saw Mill River. Site is 2 acres with a drainage area of 2.16 square miles and is entirely within the 100-year floodplain. Businesses south of this site are routinely flooded and have during rain events. But you can really see that after you get just south of the water district, it really piles up once it hits the Sawmill River. So this is another reason, I think this is a good case of why we're really trying to focus on these tributaries, because they're just a fantastic way to reduce pressure on the Sawmill River. And a lot of these sites have the space for lots of water retention. Similar to the Greenberg site, we see a lot of dying hemlocks and invasive species here. And this area, again, can be really difficult to access during the summer months, which is a shame given that these are really pretty sites and they sit within residential communities and are a great place for recreation, blitzes, bird watching, who knows? This is also a fun one because it's thought to have been an old ice lake. This picture on the left, way back. As you can see, stormwater is dispersed throughout the maps, but notice that towards the bottom, that flooding really increases dramatically once you're downstream. So there's an opportunity here for a lot of retention in that wetland. Some priorities include stormwater retention, concentrating on Nannyhagen Brook and diverting stormwater from the water district field. Another big one is support for biodiversity, and we were also considering this as a site for environmental education. Some strategies include floodplain reconnection and bank stabilization to steer water to the wetland, but also grade controls that might include riffles and wood structures and other strategies to increase retention capacity in the wetland without allowing for stormwater to simply just pool. We don't want breeding grounds for mosquitoes or anything else. So to accomplish this, we would put in some sand seepage wetlands, which would help to retain the stormwater and restore the wetland. We're also recommending a raised path or boardwalk network through the wetland to allow the space to be used even when the ground is wet or damp to minimize impact on the wetland ecosystem and native plantings. We were thinking um, that native plantings and natural systems might not always appease everyone's the aesthetic taste that you imagine when you're thinking about a natural environment. And I think it's really powerful. One's conception of nature is established at such an early age that to allow for a boardwalk to comb through what is a natural functioning ecosystem could change your perception of what is pretty, what is aesthetically pleasing. Isn't it aesthetically pleasing to see an ecosystem that is really self-sustaining? And also can be accessed no matter the quality of the weather. It can sometimes be nice to take a walk in the rain, see how this wetland manages stormwater. So moving away now from our case studies, and I'm going to bring up highlight a couple of the precedents that Biohabitats recommended that we take a look at. Um, And I should mention too that the report has a number of these precedents and they're sorted by each case study. So every time you would finish a chapter, there'd be a number of case studies with hyperlinks that you could go and check out as well that give some extra articulation of what are some of the strategies and why are we including those. So this first one that I'll focus on is in Teaneck, New Jersey in Bergen County. It is a park adjacent to a creek. It was filled with Phragmites throughout most of the park. It was also disconnected from the floodplain, and there were two outfalls that were eroding gullies. The site is very familiar to the first one that I showed, Boutilliers Brook in Hastings-on-Hudson. The main strategy that was used here was RSC, the regenerative stormwater conveyance or step pools, and that was used at both of the outfall sites. That consisted mainly of stones and wood structures to create pools and riffles, which allows for water to travel at a more stable speed down to lower parts of the site. It also eliminated the eroding gully so that water is conveyed to the creek where it is then diverted to sand seepage wetlands. These wetlands hold water in shallow pools and berms where it is then held and then slowly filtered into the creek. So this also brings some water quality benefits as it travels through those sandy embankments. It may also, by holding water upstream, you're also reducing flooding and erosion downstream. So this is one of those great case studies where by taking action, by doing some mitigation work, you're actually also helping communities downstream. So it's a much more holistic approach and it's kind approach. It's nice to do nice things. It also diverts stormwater flows from the tributaries to this part of the creek or this site. And you might also see some hummocks and hollows here that provide those microtopographies that I brought up at the Greenberg site. Those also provide areas for water to pool during rainstorms. The last precedent that I'll show, this is Euclid Creek restoration in Ohio. The main issues here were eroding and a lot of development. Mirrors a number of sites in Westchester County, which are dealing with very similar issues. The site was also chosen because it transects a transmission easement similar to Greenberg. So just thinking about when you're going through a transmission, what's the type of work that you can do? How difficult is it to go in and do maintenance on a site like that? So that's why Euclid Creek is a pretty great precedent, I think. Some of the concerns here were also about water quality, and the folks at Biohabitats saw that the area was disconnected from the floodplain. So some strategies include floodplain benches and replacing undersized culverts with riffles and adding more naturalized features to help with erosion. Great. So the report, if anyone's interested, I can drop it in the chat after this. It was released in October 2024. Um, put March 2025, but I'm not sure. But the Resilient New York report for the Saw Mill River, it's going to be quite good and should be, um, again, a nice complement to what we've done. And we believe that there are opportunities to expand this model to other watersheds in Westchester County and the Hudson Valley. So please get in touch if you're interested in discussing more about that. And I also just want to give a quick update on some other work that Groundwork Hudson Valley is doing. We're recruiting for 3 resident cohort working groups at the moment, one focused on addressing extreme heat by building shade structures in Yonkers. We also have another one called our tree canopy expansion working group, where we teach folks how to do community science tree inventory, um, through a custom app that we made, which is quite cool, and participate in some tree plantings. And then we also have an air quality working group if folks are interested in learning more about that. On Thursday, April 24th, we're planting a microforest at the Barack Obama School for Social Justice. So if you feel like seeing what that looks like, helping me plant 300 trees in a couple hours, please come down. I'm also um, more than happy to talk about microforest stuff. Um, and then lastly, on Saturday, April 26th, we have our great Saw Mill River cleanup. So please come down and help us pick up trash if you're available. And if you have any sites in mind, please get in touch. We haven't chosen our sites yet for this season. So if you have any that you think might be good, please get in touch. And thank you again for taking the time and spending your morning.
Mm, Thank you so much, Harrison, for your presentation. So exciting to see all of the work going on in the Saw Mill River watershed, the precedents from past successful projects, and how this can inform the future of how flooding is managed in this watershed. So yes, this webinar is recorded. So we've gotten that question from a lot of folks. We're recording this webinar. It will be shared on the Hudson River Watershed Alliance's YouTube channel, and we'll send a link out to everyone who's registered for the program. So I want to build on your last point, Harrison, which was this has potential for other watersheds in Westchester County, other watersheds in the Hudson River watershed. And so we had a question come in, does groundwork work in other watersheds or have any interest in doing so?
Yeah, great question. We've collaborated with some folks in the past, but not too much work. It's really been centered on the Sawmill River, but we would love to work in other watersheds.
Great. And do you have any advice for folks who are interested in taking this kind of approach in their watershed of where would be some good places to start?
I feel very grateful that we had that urban systems lab report. I think starting with modeling and identifying flood vulnerable areas is really critical. And we were also just really lucky to have that history with the Sawmill River Coalition. It was awesome to just be able to reach out to um, municipalities, the representatives from municipalities and DPWs who were always happy to give their their input and to have a close relationship with conservation advisory councils and other community members. I think it's always nice to know that when you're working on a project like this, that it's going to be of the interest of the folks who really live in that community. So I think making sure that you have all that support early on is really critical.
That's great. Thank you. Um, so, in building on that point, what options are you evaluating for funding the implementation and construction of the proposed strategies? So, what would be the next step for the plan?
Yeah. I think the next step is continuing to look out for grant funding, using this report as, hey, we have this sort of great foundational information. We know what our next steps are. I think that's also key, right? Is to when you're working on a grant, when you're finishing it, you have a clear idea of what you want to do next, and it should be building towards something. Um, so we're very keen to do some demonstration projects and to do that additional analysis that I brought up. So yeah, I think we're just kind of in a waiting period right now.
Great. And so, have any of these plans been implemented yet? And do you have any data to support how these ideas will work in practice to reduce flooding?
No, but that's a really good question. So none of them have been done just yet. Again, it's also exciting that these are like quite novel approaches. A lot of the precedents that have been brought up had just been finished in the past couple of years. But we have a good sense of where we'd want to do those. And as far as data, that is not something that we had funding to do through this report. So while we tried to be specific and thinking about what interventions would be most suitable or apt, we don't have data to back that up at this time. But that would be something that we're super keen to get.
Great. Um, the parcels that you focused on as the case studies for the presentation, can you confirm that those were owned by the state or municipalities? And what are some approaches you might recommend if problem areas are located on private property?
Another really good question. So we tried to do our best to make sure that we were covering sort of a diversity of case studies, that each one would be a bit different. So Boutilliers Brook is very residential, but still owned by the town. I think that most were owned by the town except for the Water District Field in Mount Pleasant, and that transmission easement from Con Edison, and one, and then along the Saw Mill River, that one was owned by the New York State Department of Transportation. So a pretty good mix. I do think that working with the town is good unless you're able to um, get an easement from a residential homeowner, which I think we were sort of interested to do in Hastings, just given that that's a really nice way to build community capacity and stewardship. Maintenance, everyone is always, we get this all the time with tree planting, that everyone's always going to show up for a tree planting. Everyone's going to want to plant this microforest, but it's really difficult to get people to go out and water trees and remove weeds and everything else. And a lot of the plans that we had brought up include native plantings and a lot of projects that would require probably some maintenance for at least the first few years to ensure that those plants and that environment is thriving, just whether that person is weeding or just like monitoring the development. So I think that there are some real opportunities for working with homeowners or folks that are living alongside the creek.
Great, thank you. Um, got some questions here about past studies and reports. So you had mentioned, and I put a link in the chat to some of the past Saw Mill River Watershed reports, including that flood modeling study. You had a five five-year action plan for the Sawmill River on there. You had the sort of watershed characterization state of the Sawmill River report on there. Can you talk about how these watershed plans were considered in focusing on flooding, and then also how the City Lab report and Resilient New York report have coordinated? So you mentioned this a little bit, but if you could go into a little bit more detail about how these threads came together.
Yeah, I think that so the 5-year plan was tough. It's a really nice report and it's good to read through, but it came out right before COVID hit, so we weren't really able to do much of that. I should also note that I joined the organization a year ago, so some of these were done before my time. So pardon me if anyone in the chat knows them, is a bit more familiar with them than I am. But I think that what you see is a really nice trajectory when you're reading through them. Of it really starts with how do we restore and how do we revitalize the Sawmill River? And a lot of the early reports are about native plantings and removing invasives. And it's only starting in like that 2019 report that you start to see flooding mentioned. The 2019 report's really great because it's a good survey of the entire watershed. And I think that it's always tricky because you want to be specific, but we want to be thinking about the watershed in its entirety. Um, I'm just flipping back through to see which other ones
And that
brought
2019,
up.
is that the state of the Saw?
Yeah, the 2019 is the State of the Saw Mill River Watershed. That's really, really beautifully designed and really accessible. Then the Sawmill River Inventory and Recommendations is a neat one. We did that the with a Cornell graduate school, and that one considers how can we increase access to the Sawmill River in Yonkers, especially. So Yonkers um, lacks in green space and has a very high portions, areas in Yonkers have very high heat vulnerability. So we were thinking about what are the access points that are difficult and how can we start to turn and amend elements of the Sawmill River to be more open and how can we allow for that to be like a recreational area. And then the final one, flood risk modeling in the Sawmill River watershed, that Urban Systems Lab report that DEC funded really gets into those specifics of this is about flooding. This is how this model works. This is what we saw that wasn't in the FEMA flooding. And these are the communities on a kind of more hyper specific level that are really vulnerable. And that was really a great foundational or like elemental piece of these nature-based solutions that we brought about. Because I think without those, we wouldn't have really known how to do the flood sites tour. Without that flood site tour, I don't know if we really would have had the energy and the momentum to write this report. So again, it's just kind of thinking about like how do you create that domino? And then I think the last thing you brought up was about the Resilient New York report. I can't speak too much about that, but I do know that everyone was like really keen um, to help us out with it. So we were checking in with them throughout when we were putting together what our priority sites would be. We wanted to make sure with that it wouldn't be duplicative with the high risk areas that would be featured in that. So another reason why we wanted to focus on those tributaries.
Thank you. Do you think that the severe flooding impacts that have happened in the Sawmill River have created conditions so that the municipalities are more open to implementing nature-based solutions?
Yes, I think so. I think also that I think that we've seen that hard gray infrastructure alone does not work and how quickly it can be aged out. And I think that um, folks within the Selma River watershed are also really keen to support biodiversity and are more interested in their local ecosystems. I think that if we think about early on what the Sawmill River Coalition was trying to do through the Great Sawmill River Cleanup and other community events is it allowed folks to go and see and spend time in a river that is so often ignored. It's also something that we've seen with just doing street tree inventory. There's so much about our daily lives that elements of nature become very quotidian, very everyday, very like almost banal, but when you take time to kind of spend time in them, you start to really treasure them and take some you want to steward them and you want to take so I think that people get really excited when they think about the potential of a site. I think about that Butilio's Brook site again in that residential community where you can see like people are throwing trash in there and everything else, but it's actually quite pretty. And I think to open it up and to restore it in some capacity would be a really wonderful resource.
Great. And I think what's interesting too about nature-based features are some of the trade-offs that we see here too. So we've got a really good question here about trade-offs related to creating flood benching, which is one I've heard before. So that there's a concern that there are mature native trees on the bank which do absorb water and have great biodiversity benefits, et cetera. And those may need to be cut down to create a flood bench. So, how do you approach these different trade-offs when thinking about natural and nature-based features?
Yeah, I mean, I think about the what's happening in New York City right now with the East Coast Resiliency Project, where folks were really, concerned with all the like mature trees that had been cut down for that project. So I think we just don't know. I don't want to speak about anything that we're not working on yet, but you never want to cut down a tree that is established. We know that um, a mature tree is doing so much for a local ecosystem that you really do need to do a really thoughtful benefit cost analysis and think qualitatively about what you're doing when you are chopping a tree down like that.
Right. And similarly, have the projects considered aquatic organism passage in addition to their flood benefits?
Such a fun question. So we do a lot of eel monitoring and eel mopping at the at the barge. And I know that the Center for the Urban River at BZAC also does a bunch of that. So we're certainly thinking about eels when we think about the Saw Mill River. I think it's tough. I was like at a actually where I met you, Emily, at the river rally last year. There was a great presentation on like the importance of finding those charismatic species for a river or for a watershed and how that can really galvanize support and an interest. And I keep thinking, I think most days, I think at least for 3 or 4 minutes about how can we really make the eel really fun? Do you put a hat on an eel? What do you do to make it the charismatic species that Saw Mill River deserves? But they're very cool.
Great. And yes, full disclosure, Harrison and I met in Michigan at the River Rally conference because we sat next to each other to see a great presentation. And it turned out we were both working in the Hudson River watershed, and it's a small world, that's for sure. Okay, does the report recommendations take into account future flood predictions and more extreme weather?
No, that's a really good question. It does not. I think that we can, um, again, that's the value of modeling is I think that those same areas are just going to flood and flood more dramatically. There's also, I encourage anyone who's interested in this sort of thing to also see what Eric Sanderson at the New York Botanical Garden has been doing with his, I think it's called the blue spots, but essentially looking at, if you look at historical water patterns where water wants to flow, that's probably where flooding is going to happen. It's just going to happen more dramatically. I think it's also important to remember that one of the issues that we're seeing with flooding right now is not that it's raining more, but that those precipitation patterns are just shifting. So you're getting the same amount of water annually, but it's happening in much the duration that you're getting it is changed.
And again, looking ahead towards implementation, are there any specific grants or funding sources that you're considering that might be helpful for other folks to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I'm not sure right now. I mean, we're certainly looking at what New York State is putting out. So we're just keeping an eye on those and love the Hudson River Estuary program.
Great. And actually, I see a note in the chat that I think just went to the hosts, but the Environmental Facilities Corporation of New York State has a Green Innovation Grant Program that's currently open, and applications are being accepted to implement green infrastructure projects. And so that might be a good one for folks who are interested in implementing these kinds of projects to keep an eye out for. And then, as I mentioned at the top of the program, we're also through the Hudson Valley Flood Resilience Network, hosting a webinar with Hastings on Hudson, which was featured in part in this presentation, and grant funding that they received through the Resiliency Grant Program to do some stormwater improvements that can mitigate residential flooding in their community as well. We've got another note, keep in mind FEMA mitigation grants as well. The Hudson River Watershed Alliance always has a grant roundup in our monthly email newsletter, and there's lots of other ways that you can stay up to date on potential funding opportunities for these kinds of projects. So in our last little bit of time here, Harrison, what's a microforest?
Thank you so much. Someone can see that I'm just tortured by this, but I'm also so excited by it. A microforest is a dense planting of trees in a very small area. So even like a couple parking lots could fit trees. And essentially you plant a tree every other meter. It became really popularized in the 1970s through this botanist named Akira Miyawaki, who formed the Miyawaki method. And he was working in post-industrial sites in Japan and trying to remediate soil by planting large canopy trees and just planting um, not succession trees, but the final tree. So you just plant a lot, like 70% oaks and maples, and no pioneering species. And what he found is if you plant them very densely and they compete for sunlight, that you can get a forest that looks as if it's 100 years old in 10 years. People were really attracted by that. So it has made its way over to the UK and is now coming to the US. We're planting 300 trees in 1,000 square feet, and we're altering that method just slightly, where we're not doing the soil remediation or amendment that is commonly seen. A lot of the tiny forests will ask to remove like 2 feet of soil and just put in a ton of new soil and compost and everything else. So essentially creating the conditions that oaks thrive in, but instead we're trying to create a more natural forest succession. So we're planting a lot of ground cover. So we're amending it a little bit where it's about 5% canopy trees, and then we have some understory trees, some woody shrubs, and some herbaceous ground cover. So we're very excited to see how it turns out. It's an experiment, but we think that it's going to be an awesome way to provide some cooling benefits to a high school with very few trees and capture a bunch of stormwater and get kids really interested in far succession and maybe even nature bathing. Who knows? We're gonna have a path through the middle of it.
That's great. Well, we'll have to have you back and tell us how it all went after the planting. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us this morning for our breakfast webinar. Thank you again, Harrison, for sharing all of this really insightful information from the Saw Mill River Watershed. Lots of inspiring information, and I think there's a lot of folks who will take a close look at the reports that you shared, myself included. Reminder, if you want to support the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, come celebrate World Water Day with us on March 22nd at Rough Draft in Kingston. Join the Hudson Valley Flood Resilience Network if you're interested in other upcoming webinars and in-person programs focused on flooding. And we will see you next month. All of you who have been registered will be added to the Hudson River Watershed Alliance's monthly email newsletter, so you'll hear about the next in our monthly breakfast webinar series. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.